You won't believe this, but one morning I walked out to my porch, coffee in hand, and found my entire ranch surrounded by a brand new fence that I never approved. The air was crisp, the sun was just climbing over the horizon, and the smell of fresh cut would hit my nose before I even saw what had been done. I remember squinting through the morning haze, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, the fence was real, tall, and sturdy, with shiny metal hinges that looked like they had been installed just hours ago. It wrapped around my property like a snake coiling around its prey. At first, I thought it might have been some kind of prank. Maybe my buddies from town decided to have a little fun. We've pulled pranks before, cattle painted with washable dye, hay bales stacked into weird shapes, but this? This was on another level. It wasn't until I walked closer and saw the bold letters on the signs bolted to the fence posts that my stomach dropped. HOA property, access restricted. My first reaction was confusion. HOA? What did they have to do with me? I'd never signed up for any homeowners association, and I sure as hell hadn't given anyone permission to touch my land. I stood there for a good minute, just staring at that sign. My cattle were grazing inside the fence line. My truck sat in front of the barn, my tools neatly arranged in my workshop, the old tractor parked under its shed, all of it now locked inside like prisoners in a walled city. The fence was so high you couldn't climb it without a ladder, and the only entrance was a heavy steel gate with a thick, brand new padlock. And the strangest part? I didn't have a key. I walked toward the gate, my boots crunching on the gravel, and that's when I saw them, two people standing there like they owned the place. I recognized them immediately. They were members of the HOA board from the nearby subdivision, the kind of people who always had clipboards in their hands and disapproving looks on their faces. They wore smug expressions, like cats that had just swallowed canaries. "Morning," one of them said, adjusting his sunglasses. "You can't go through here. This is now common property for the HOA." I almost laughed, thinking he had to be joking. "Common property? This is my ranch," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. The woman next to him crossed her arms and gave me a condescending smile. "Well, technically, you're inside the new HOA boundaries. We voted to include your land for community safety and maintenance purposes. It's nothing personal. The fence is for everyone's protection." Protection? From what? The deer that wandered through at night? The occasional raccoon raiding my chicken coop? This was nonsense, and they knew it. I'd lived on this land for years, long before their neatly manicured subdivision popped up on the other side of the county road. My ranch was quiet, peaceful, and most importantly, private. I clenched my jaw and took a deep breath. Part of me wanted to start yelling right then and there, to demand they tear the fence down immediately, but something told me to hold back. Instead, I leaned against the fence post and studied them. Their eyes darted between me and each other, clearly expecting me to cause a scene. "So let me get this straight," I said slowly. "You built a fence on my property, locked my things inside, and you didn't think to give me a key?" The man shrugged. "Well, once you officially join the HOA and pay the dues, you'll be given full access. It's just policy." Ah, there it was. The real reason. They wanted to force me into their HOA, make me pay their ridiculous fees, and control what I could and couldn't do on my own land. I didn't need their permission to paint my barn, build a shed, or park my truck. And I wasn't about to start needing it now. I gave them a slow smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Interesting policy you've got there," I said, turning away and walking back toward my house. Inside, my blood was boiling, but my mind was already working. If there's one thing I've learned from years of ranching, it's that you don't charge into a problem like a bull at a gate. You take your time, find the weak spot, and then you make your move. From my porch, I could see the fence stretching across the fields, cutting right through my property like a scar. My cattle were restless, wandering near the barrier, unsure of this new boundary that had appeared overnight. The creek still flowed on the far side, but now it was separated from my main pasture. It was a mess, but I wasn't going to let it stay that way. I sipped my coffee, my mind running through options. I could call the sheriff, but I had a feeling the HOA would have some excuse ready. I could try to break the lock, but that would put me in the wrong legally. No, I needed to hit them where it hurt, not just remove the fence, but make them regret ever putting it up in the first place. Little did they know, I had an ace up my sleeve. I knew this land like the back of my hand. I knew where the property lines were, where the easements ran, and, more importantly, who actually owned the only road leading into their subdivision. And I had a hunch that road ran right through part of my land. If that was true, then the fence they just built might be the biggest mistake they'd ever made. I didn't let them see me sweat. I acted calm, almost indifferent, as I went back inside to grab my truck keys. But deep down, I knew the game had just begun. They thought they could box me in, force me into submission, but they had no idea they just poked a man who knew exactly how to fight back. And win. What came next would turn their smug little HOA world upside down, and it would all start with a trip to the county records office. The county records office was quiet that morning, the kind of quiet where you can hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. I walked in, hat in hand, and the receptionist gave me a curious look as I asked for the property surveys and easement maps for my ranch and the surrounding area. She slid a form across the counter, and I filled it out, my pen scratching against the paper like a shovel digging into dirt. When she returned with a stack of documents and maps rolled into a tube, I carried them to a nearby table and spread them out. The paper smelled faintly of dust and ink, the kind of smell that told you this was where the real truth lived, not in HOA meeting minutes or in their smug speeches, but in black and white lines that had stood for decades. As I traced my finger along the boundaries, a slow grin began to spread across my face. Just as I suspected, my land extended farther than the HOA probably realized. The road that connected their subdivision to the main highway? It crossed a stretch of my property for about 200 feet before curving toward their neighborhood. In other words, the only way in or out of their precious community was through my land. And here's the kicker, the section they'd fenced off. It wasn't just blocking my ranch, they had accidentally locked off their own access road in the process. I leaned back in my chair, imagining the chaos this must have already caused. Residents trying to leave for work, delivery trucks idling outside the gate, kids missing the school bus. And all because their HOA decided they could play cowboy and fence me in. Well, now the tables were turning. I took out my phone and snapped photos of the survey maps. I also grabbed copies of the official property deeds, paying the small fee without hesitation. That paperwork was my ammunition, and I was about to load both barrels. The next stop was the hardware store, where I picked up a brand new, industrial-grade padlock. The kind you couldn't bust open with bolt cutters unless you wanted to spend half an hour at it. I also bought a heavy-duty chain, thick enough to tow a tractor. On my way back, I called up my friend Mike, a locksmith who owed me a favor. When I explained the situation, he laughed so hard I thought he might drop the phone. "Be right there," he said. "This is gonna be fun." By the time Mike arrived, I'd already parked my truck near the gate. The HOA's shiny new padlock was still hanging there, untouched. Mike got to work, tools clicking and turning, and within minutes, the lock popped open. I took it off, tossed it into the bed of my truck, and slid my new chain through the gate, securing it with my heavy-duty padlock. I slipped the only key onto my keyring and gave it a satisfying spin. Mike grinned. "You know they're gonna lose their minds when they see this, right?" "That's the point," I replied, smiling just enough to show I meant business. That afternoon, my phone started buzzing like an angry hornet's nest. Unknown numbers, HOA board members, even a couple of residents I vaguely recognized from the subdivision. They all wanted to know why the gate was locked, why they couldn't get to their houses, and when I was going to unlock it. I let most of the calls go to voicemail, but when the HOA president herself finally called, I decided to answer. Her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "You need to unlock that gate right now. You're obstructing community access, and that's illegal." I let her finish her little speech before speaking. "Actually, ma'am, what's illegal is building a fence on someone else's land without permission. See, I went to the county records office today, and it turns out that the only access road to your subdivision runs through my property. And since you fenced it off and put a lock on it, I had no choice but to secure my property. Now, if you and your residents want access, I'm willing to lease the road to you, for a monthly fee." There was a long pause, then a disbelieving laugh. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm dead serious," I said. "And just so you know, I'm charging a commercial road lease rate. That means you'll be paying for every month you've been using my land without an agreement. And since you trespassed to build that fence, I'll also be charging a construction trespass fee." Her voice went up an octave. "You can't do that. We'll take you to court." "You're welcome to try," I replied calmly. "But you might want to call the county first and ask them who owns that strip of land. They'll tell you exactly what I just did. And while you're at it, maybe ask them how long it'll take to get an emergency road permit, because until then, that gate stays locked." I hung up before she could say another word. Not long after, I saw a line of cars parked along the county road outside the fence. Residents were carrying grocery bags, backpacks, even pet carriers as they trudged down the gravel path to their houses. Some glared at me as I drove past, others just looked confused and exhausted. I knew some of them weren't part of the decision to fence me in, but this wasn't about being nice. This was about setting boundaries, literally and legally. By the next morning, the HOA had called an emergency meeting. They sent me a formal notice, probably expecting me to show up meekly and apologize. But I walked into that meeting like I owned the place, because in a way, I did. Without access to that road, their million-dollar homes were just pretty cages. When I stepped into the room, the air was thick with tension. Board members sat at a long table, papers spread in front of them. A few residents sat in folding chairs along the wall, their expressions a mix of curiosity and frustration. The HOA president started to speak, rattling off bylaws and claiming I was violating community agreements. I let her finish, leaning casually against the wall. When she was done, I stepped forward and pulled out my copies of the survey map and property deed. I spread them across the table so everyone could see. "This," I said, tapping the shaded section, "is my land. Your road runs through it. Your fence is on it. That means you're trespassing. The only legal way for you to use it from now on is to lease it from me." The room went silent except for the sound of papers rustling. One board member muttered something about calling the sheriff. I smiled and pointed toward the door, where a county deputy stood leaning against the frame. I had invited him myself, and he'd already reviewed the documents before coming in. "Everything he's saying checks out," the deputy said. "He's well within his rights." The HOA president's face went pale. She knew she had no leverage left. I gave them my terms, a fair monthly rate for road use, plus a one-time trespass fee. If they agreed, I'd unlock the gate and let life go back to normal, with the understanding that I kept control of the only key. If they didn't, well, they could enjoy walking in from the county road every day. I gave them 48 hours to decide, then tipped my hat and walked out, leaving them to stew in their own mess. And as I drove back to my ranch, I couldn't help but chuckle. The fence they'd built to trap me had become the very thing trapping them, and I had no intention of letting them forget it. When the 48-hour deadline I'd given them finally rolled around, I knew the HOA would try one last round of games before they caved. That's just how people like them operated. They didn't like losing, and they hated losing to someone they thought they could control. Sure enough, early that morning, I heard the sound of gravel crunching outside my ranch. I stepped onto my porch and saw 3 SUVs parked near the gate. Out climbed the HOA president, 2 board members, and a man in a suit who was clearly their lawyer. I watched them from the porch for a minute, sipping my coffee, letting them stew in the awkwardness. They waved me over, but I just called out, "If you've got something to say, you can say it from there." The lawyer stepped forward and tried his best, intimidating voice. "We're here to inform you that the HOA will be filing for a court injunction to remove that lock and regain access to the road." I smiled slowly, walking toward the fence until I was standing just a few feet away. "That's fine," I said. "But before you do, you might want to read this." I pulled from my jacket a copy of my deed, the property survey, and a letter from the county land office confirming, in writing, that I owned that section of land and had never granted any easement rights to the HOA. I handed it through the fence to the lawyer. His confident expression melted as he scanned the documents, his eyes darting from page to page. The president, meanwhile, was shifting uncomfortably, probably realizing that if they pushed this to court, they'd lose badly, and publicly. "I'll make this simple," I continued. "The lease rate is the same as I told you 2 days ago. You sign the agreement, you get access. You refuse, you find yourself explaining to every one of your residents why they've been walking a half-mile from the county road for the last 2 days." The board members exchanged glances. They were cracking. The lawyer whispered something to the president, who looked like she'd just swallowed a mouthful of vinegar. Finally, she muttered, "We'll meet this afternoon to decide." "Good," I said, and turned my back on them. Negotiation over. That afternoon, I drove into town, knowing they'd be holding their deciding meeting at the community center. I didn't plan on barging in, not yet. I figured I'd give them some space to argue among themselves. In my experience, when a group like this feels cornered, the infighting starts, and that's when you win. I parked a block away and waited in my truck, sipping a soda and watching people trickle into the building. Some residents looked angry, others looked desperate. I could tell the situation was wearing on them. Hauling groceries and kids back and forth in the August heat wasn't just inconvenient, it was miserable. An hour later, the meeting doors burst open. People came out talking loudly, some shaking their heads, others laughing in disbelief. I spotted one resident I vaguely knew, a guy named Tom who occasionally bought hay from me. He spotted me and walked over. "Guess what?" he said. "They're caving. They don't like it, but they're gonna pay you. Everyone voted to approve the lease because no one can live like this. Even the president finally admitted you had them beat." I couldn't help grinning. "Appreciate the update, Tom. Sounds like they're learning about property rights the hard way." By the time I got back to my ranch, the HOA president had left a voicemail on my phone. She sounded like she was trying very hard to keep her tone professional, but there was no hiding the bitterness in her voice. They had agreed to my terms. They wanted the agreement signed the next morning so I could unlock the gate. The following day, I arrived at the community center with 2 copies of the written lease. The terms were straightforward. They would pay a fixed monthly amount for road use, plus the one-time trespass and construction fee. Payment was due on the 1st of every month. If they failed to pay within 10 days, the gate would be locked again until payment was received. I also included a clause making it clear that I retained ownership of the road, the fence section on my land, and the only gate key. The lawyer tried to suggest that they should get a duplicate key for emergencies. I shut that down immediately. "You've already proven you can't be trusted with access to my property," I said. "You want to keep using my road, you call me when you need the gate opened." Reluctantly, they signed. I signed. We exchanged copies. The deal was sealed. Once the ink was dry, we all drove back to the gate. I walked up, slid my key into the padlock, and turned it with a loud click. The chain rattled as I unwrapped it from the gatepost. The HOA president stepped forward like she might try to take the lock from me, but I held it firmly in my hand. "This stays with me," I said flatly. "You get access, not ownership." She didn't say a word, just stepped aside as I pushed the gate open. Cars began rolling through almost immediately. Residents who'd been waiting on the county road rushed in like they'd just been freed from prison. Some waved to me in thanks, others didn't even make eye contact. I didn't care either way. This wasn't about being liked, it was about making sure they understood the cost of overstepping. Over the next week, things started to settle down. The monthly lease check arrived exactly on time, just as I'd stipulated. Word spread quickly around town about what had happened. Neighbors and other landowners started calling me to ask how I'd managed to outmaneuver the HOA. Some were dealing with their own battles against overreach and wanted advice. I told them the same thing I'd told myself that first morning: know your property lines, keep your paperwork in order, and never let anyone bully you out of your rights. Still, the HOA president tried to save face. She sent out a newsletter to residents claiming the road lease was a temporary arrangement for community harmony, but everyone knew better. The fact was, they were paying me to use their own access road, and I had the only key that made it possible. One evening, about a month later, I was sitting on my porch when I saw the president herself drive up to the gate. She got out, walked to the lock, and just stared at it for a moment. I could almost see the frustration boiling in her. Then she got back in her car and drove away without a word. That's when it hit me, this wasn't just a win. This was a permanent reminder to them that their little HOA empire had limits. They could make all the rules they wanted inside their subdivision, but they couldn't touch my land without paying for the privilege. And the best part? Every time I passed through that gate, unlocking it with my key, I felt that same satisfaction I'd felt the moment I replaced their lock with mine. They thought they could trap me, but all they really did was lock themselves in, and hand me the only way out. From that day forward, life on my ranch settled into a rhythm again, but it wasn't the same as before, it was better. The air felt fresher, the mornings quieter, and every time I stepped outside and saw that big steel gate, I couldn't help but grin. What had started as an attempt to box me in had turned into the best real estate deal I'd ever made, one where the tenants didn't even get a front door without my say-so. The first month's lease check cleared without a hitch. It was a satisfying sight seeing that payment hit my account, knowing that money came straight from the very people who once thought they could strong-arm me into their HOA. I didn't spend it recklessly either. I used part of it to upgrade some fencing around my cattle pastures, bought a few new tools for the workshop, and stashed the rest away in savings. I figured if they were going to pay me for the privilege of driving on my land, I might as well make sure my land stayed in top condition. And make no mistake, I enforced the lease terms down to the letter. If there was road maintenance to be done, they had to go through me to schedule it. If an emergency vehicle needed to come through, I got the call to unlock the gate. The agreement gave me the authority to control all access, and I took that seriously. It wasn't about being petty, it was about ensuring they never forgot that they were on borrowed ground. The funny thing was, a few of the residents actually started warming up to me. At first, most of them gave me cold stares, as if I was the villain in their HOA fairy tale. But over time, some realized that it wasn't me who caused their inconvenience, it was their own board's arrogance. One man in particular, an older fellow named Frank, stopped by one afternoon while I was working in the barn. He brought me a 6-pack of beer and said, "Just for the record, I voted against that fence. Always thought it was a bad idea." We ended up sitting on the tailgate of my truck, talking about cattle feed prices and the sorry state of politics in the county. Still, not everyone learned their lesson. About 3 months after the agreement, the HOA tried to test the waters. They sent me a letter suggesting that since community relations had improved, they should be given a spare key to the gate for efficiency purposes. I didn't even bother writing back. Instead, I called their president and said, "The answer is still no, and if you keep pushing, I'll add an amendment to the lease increasing the rent." That shut the conversation down quick. Then came the holiday season, and with it, a new kind of chaos. Delivery trucks were lined up along the county road, waiting for me to open the gate. At first, I thought it might get annoying, but then I realized I could work it to my advantage. I set specific times during the day when I would open the gate for deliveries. If a truck missed the window, they had to come back the next day. It kept things organized for me and served as another reminder that this was my road, my rules. Some folks might think that was too much control, but the truth was, I'd been forced into this position by their own actions. If the HOA had just left me alone, none of this would have happened. But they'd chosen to build a fence on land that wasn't theirs, and they'd tried to push me into joining their little club. They made their bed, now they could lie in it. One particularly cold January morning, I got a knock at my door. It was the county sheriff. My first thought was that the HOA had finally tried something drastic. But when I opened the door, the sheriff smiled and said, "Don't worry, nothing's wrong. I just came by to say, nice work." Heard the whole story from one of my deputies. Not many people stand their ground against those HOA types and actually win. That was the moment I realized this story had spread way beyond my little corner of the county. Folks from other towns started calling me, asking for advice on how to handle pushy HOAs or neighbors who thought they could rewrite property lines. Some even came out to see the infamous gate for themselves, almost like it was a tourist attraction. And honestly, I didn't mind. The more people who knew that standing your ground worked, the better. Spring rolled around, and the pastures started to green up again. My cattle were healthy, the creek was flowing strong, and my property was more secure than ever. The HOA kept sending their monthly payments like clockwork, and I kept unlocking the gate for them when needed. Every interaction we had was polite, but there was always an undercurrent of tension, as if they still hoped one day I might just hand over the key. They didn't understand that the key wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of